Hi and welcome to today's webinar on making an impact from large-scale technology transformation investment. My name is Jeremy Cowan. I'm editorial director and co-founder of IoT Now, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator today. Thank you for joining us wherever we find you. It's fair to say that digital transformation strategy is a priority for most CxOs at the moment. COVID has forced a lot of change already, and now research says that 90% of industrial companies are investing in digital factories. And over 70% of executives consider digital strategy to be at the top of their agenda. However, many companies fail to achieve the necessary impact, speed, and scale that delivers significant business value. In order to have an impact and to succeed in your digital strategy, you have to make it a C-suite agenda issue, and you need to get the board to drive adoption at scale, involving cross-functional stakeholders. So in this masterclass today, we're going to learn from experts how to pitch for digital investments at scale to your board or investors. That includes getting executive sponsorship and identifying the strategic decision drivers. It goes through building an ecosystem of technology providers to creating a program to execute the digital transformation project. And just a reminder, as usual, this webinar is being recorded and you can access it from tomorrow at iot-now.com. Today's discussion is brought to you with our partners at PTC. We're proud to be working with the global providers of software, solutions, and services, enabling digital transformation for enterprises. And we're also supported today by Transformer Insights, a research firm focused on the world of digital transformation, often called DX for short. So the first thing to do is introduce you to our speakers. Let's welcome them in order of appearance. It's a pleasure to see the return of a longtime friend of IoT Now, Jim Morrish. Jim is a co-founder of Transformer Insights. Good to have you here, Jim.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's good to be with you.
And our second speaker is Paul Hames, Vice President of Technical Sales for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa at PTC. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks for the invite to join you today.
Not at all. Thank you both. Well, the format for today starts with an audience poll where we ask you for the biggest concern facing you in your digital transformation strategy. Now, if you want to take part in the poll, and we hope you will see on your screen there is an icon for a sidebar, and you can hide or unhide the sidebar at any time. On there, you will see a poll option. And if you click on that, we will invite you to answer now and submit your vote by clicking at the bottom. So the question is as follows. What is the biggest challenge and or concern in your digital transformation strategy? Is it getting executive buy-in and lack of strategic vision around the technology? Is it suitable models to assess the return on investment or ROI? Is it getting cross-functional collaboration and overcoming resistance to change? Is it finding a systematic approach to program governance? Or is it overcoming a lack of skills and talent to realize the value from a digital transformation investment? I won't read out all of the answers because they're quite long, but what is the biggest challenge and or concern in your digital transformation strategy? Let's have a look and you'll see in real time it's developing as we go, as we get more and more replies coming in. I see a strong lead at the moment for the first answer, which is getting a suitable model to assess the return on investment. I'm not sure if that's your expectation, Paul, but it certainly seems a very sensible place to start.
It is absolutely, Jeremy. I think, again, some of the early projects we saw a lot of companies perhaps with too much of a technology focus, not enough of a business case, and understanding exactly how the technology is going to unlock value within the business. And I think this is something where we've seen a shift in the industry, and I'll touch a little bit on that on my presentation later.
Yeah. Jim, was this your expectation to see ROI so high in the charts, as it were?
I'm not surprised to see ROI high, but the suitable model piece is interesting. It'd be interesting to unpick that a little bit, because one of the things about a suitable model is a model that reflects the business. And the fact is that there's an investment in many IoT or digital transformation solutions. It's not just an investment in a solution, it's an investment in a solution which is the beginning of a transformation of a business. So what that raises is the questions of how you identify the costs for the project, how you allocate them to that project versus the strategy and the portfolio of projects you'll eventually build on whatever platforms it is you're investing in today. So if you want to build what I might term a grand unified model, then that is a remarkably complicated thing. So it'd be interesting to unpick at some point maybe what sits behind there, and thoughts from the audience or questions the audience definitely appreciated on that one.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you've anticipated very well. I'm going to be looking for your questions from the audience, please, that I can put to our panel at the end. That will come in the final section after Paul has spoken. But first, I'm going to have a chat here with Jim, because I want to understand a little bit more about where you think the industry is going on this, Jim. Let's say a company has agreed in outline that it needs to digitize its factory or its services. I mean, I think my first question, Jim, would be, assuming most companies don't have experience of digitally transforming their business, and why would they, where and how do they begin?
Yes, thanks, Jeremy. And this is actually a perfect pair, or a complementary question to the ROI question, because the question about where you begin very much relates to the scope of what it is you're trying to address, and in turn, the scope of what you're trying to address depends on what you're trying to reflect in a business model, and how you treat the costs and the cost dynamics within that. So it is an incredibly complicated space. In terms of first steps for deployment, though, that trusty, where do I start question, probably the first thing I would say to do would be to find out what the leaders in your industry are doing. There are always leaders within an industry. You might have different companies which are leading in different areas within that particular industry. So finding out what they're doing, better understanding the development trajectory of your industry is probably the first place to start. Mm-hmm. The next thing to do is to look at deployments in comparable markets and industries. So many things that have been deployed in one market or one situation can have implications for different verticals. Take, for instance, something like fleet management of yellow machines in a construction industry environment. There are some quite sophisticated models there in terms of sharing the usage of devices between different parties that are present on a work site, etc., and actually how these things are charged for and how they're managed and how they're leased out and moved between sites. There's some quite sophisticated things going on in there. Some of the things that are going on in that kind of solution could be relevant to, for instance, somebody operating a fleet of ambulances. Completely different industry, but there could be some relevant lessons to be learned. So looking outside your own industry at things to comparable elements of different verticals and different industries is quite important. Figuring out you can't do everything. transform everything that's right at the start. So you've got to identify the key use cases that are likely to be most impactful. Focus on those first. Figure out which of the digital transformation technologies are most relevant to you. That's driven by the use case identification. So it could be things like artificial intelligence, it could be IoT, it could be different types of connectivity, it could be private 5G networks in a factory, etc. So you need to then get familiar with those relevant areas of technology, and rule out the areas of technology that you don't need to get familiar with. So if you're operating within a factory in a private network environment, then potentially blockchain is one of the less relevant. And then prioritize who has supported those kind of deployments. So there's a lot of first steps you can take there.
Well, one of the things that seems to crop up again and again when talking about transformations is the corporate culture and the corporate mindset. How should enterprises change their mindset from treating transformation as though it's an ad hoc one-off project to a managed environment going forward?
Well, that again, that's correct, and this again, the direction of that question very tightly ties to the ROI question again. At the beginning, within a company, relatively few are familiar with digital transformation and what could be done with digital transformation, and that needs to change. You need to get everyone within the organization understanding what can be done. You need to get a detailed and documented view of the potential of what the company can do and how it should be working. And DX needs to get onto the agenda of the leadership. There need to be stakeholders appointed, budgets allocated, and competitors and comparable industries tracked, and a proactive seeking of lessons learned. And in general, the thing needs to move from an ad hoc approach to technology deployment. So identify a problem, find those technologies and deploy a solution. It needs to move to a much more established and integrated ideation process, with tools and techniques to sharpen propositions, develop a portfolio of opportunities to be pursued, sequence those, figure out what the dependencies are, and plot an overall journey. So move away from a tactical single deployment to initiating a journey.
And I guess implicit in that, you touched on it there, is ownership. Really, is ambassadorial level, C level, owning the problem and holding it ongoing. It sounds as though it's hard to align the implementation of that kind of transformation within an enterprise's broader business strategy, because it has to be seen as part of the whole. What are the steps then? You've talked about the short term. What are the steps to take in the medium and long term?
So moving beyond this planning stage, you get to a more of an implementation and solution lifecycle stage. So managing that live solution in live operations, and firstly, that needs to be very closely connected to the business strategy. So there needs to be an iterative relationship between business strategy development and implementation, and there need to be tried and tested mechanisms for dealing with any unforeseen or unexpected problems. The volumes projection and the technical designs need to be undertaken in a cohesive way, so there's some kind of concept of a reference architecture, and you don't get multiple different solutions configured in completely different ways. And there are some common processes and procedures and gates and decision points as things get deployed. And project teams, of course, need to be staffed and optimized across the business, rather than grabbing whoever's available to deploy a specific project. It needs to be managed against a portfolio of projects and a digital transformation journey overall.
Yeah. I suppose along the way, one goal is to try and create, and indeed to stick to, a list of approved technologies and approved providers, and to follow relevant standards. That's an easy thing to let slip. But for an agreed inventory of assets, I mean, that must be way easier to say than to do. How do you take that on?
Absolutely, it is. It is much easier to say than to do, but it is necessary, because otherwise, if you deploy multiple solution providers for each individual solution of a range of solutions, you can end up with a hodgepodge of really quite inconsistent things. And governance in that environment, and understanding how things integrate, and when one version of software updates, what the impacts are on other, that becomes an incredibly difficult thing. So you do need some way of identifying a set of standards and technologies and technology partners to support your journey. In contention with that, though, of course, you do need to leave space for the new technology providers and the innovative providers, because this is an innovative space, and you do need to admit new people to that portfolio, or new providers to that portfolio, to help you, develop your overall strategy. So it's very much a balancing thing. Standards obviously are a given. You got to understand those, and beyond that, systems provision and management of that vendor portfolio, you actually need to understand what you've got, in the ground, as it were, at the moment. What are the solutions? What are the data? What data sources and information are coming from different parts of your organization? Where potentially could those information sources be available? Very high-grained, very accurate, granular information about a particular sensor may be available within a factory, but you couldn't view that same level of information on the other side of the world, just because of the bandwidth required to support the video feed or whatever it is. So you need to understand, or at least it wouldn't be so timely, it wouldn't be real time. So you need to understand what it is that can be available where, and what the compromises are, and how information can be moved within your companies. That overall systems environment, it's a vendor environment, it's a solution environment, and it's a notion of what that solution environment could potentially support as well. Very important.
Yeah. Jim, I feel it would be wrong for us to, even in a brief discussion like this, to conclude it without even touching on security. Obviously, it's got to be robust, it's got to be international, indeed global, and it's got to be consistent throughout the business. And it's got to be up to date. I almost forgot that. I mean, how can companies achieve all of that?
Yes, security is without doubt very important, and it's a significant challenge. And there are three main domains within it. There's governance, enablement, and hardening. So you've got to put processes in place to identify the vulnerabilities, and undertake documented processes to keep things up to date. You've got to also regularly assess vulnerabilities, etc. What I would say, though, on the topic of security, whilst it's very important, I think there's a bigger topic, and the bigger topic is trustworthiness. And trustworthiness introduces the concept of a solution doing what it is you expect it to. So performing safely, performing reliably, defending privacy, and maintaining safety even in failure situations. So safety of workers and customers, end users, whoever. So trust is a wider concept, and that becomes important when the IT domain starts impacting the real world and OT assets. It becomes quite important. And the last thing I'd say on that, though, is that there's a notion that you can't have enough security, and security is really important. Well, security is important, but I think you can have too much of it. So, for instance, if you took the security protocols that were in place at a nuclear power plant and you installed those in a factory that's manufacturing wooden fence posts, that would be too much. That would be unnecessary cost investment. It'd be lack of agility, lack of flexibility in the latter environment. So it is natural that security needs to be right sized for the challenge and the task at hand. And I think that's the other key aspect of security. So security is bigger than just security. It's trustworthiness, and it can be right sized. It's not just more is better.
So after years of the IoT sector being accused of not taking security sufficiently seriously, now we don't want to go too far the other direction. It's got to be appropriate.
That would be my view, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. I think that's really helpful. Now, if anybody has any questions about anything that you hear this afternoon from Jim or from Paul, please use the questions tab that you'll find next to the poll tab that hopefully you used to answer in the poll earlier. You'll find it in the sidebar, and you can submit a question to us at any time, starting right now. And I'll do my best to put as many as I can to our panelists at the end. But I don't want to hold back anymore. I want to hear about best practice in DX. So, Paul, it's over to you. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. So let me just advance onto a few slides that I've got to share with your listeners today. So before we start, I thought I'd begin with just a quick introduction to PTC, as I'm conscious some of the listeners might not know who PTC are. So we're a reasonably large US headquartered software company. We're located in Boston is our headquarters, in the Seaport district, which is one of those emerging sort of tech districts on the east coast of the United States. Now, as a company, we're probably best known for two disruptive technologies around the engineering and manufacturing space. We were first to market in the late 80s with a computer-aided design technology called ProEngineer. And then about 10 years later, we were first to market with internet-centric product lifecycle management with Windchill. And then over the last 5 or so years, we've spent close on $1 billion, either organically or through acquisition, developing our IoT stack under the ThingWorx banner. Now, we've got about 30,000 customers around the world, everybody from Airbus to Ferrari and everything in between. And we're about 6,500 employees, up from a little bit on the slide there now, and about 250 here in the UK, which is obviously where I'm talking to you from today. So that's just a little bit on PTC. Now, what are we seeing in the market today? Now, I'm going to begin with perhaps a quick look back in time to the introduction of electricity onto the shop floor. Now, the picture on the slide is actually SKF's Gothenburg factory, where they manufactured bearings around about 100 years ago. And this is where the story starts, almost around the sort of start of the second industrial revolution, when electrification came to the factory. Now, they started to implement electric motors, but the interesting thing is that productivity didn't actually increase in that factory for something like 25 to 30 years. And that was long enough for an entire generation of managers at SKF to actually retire from the business. Now, what that management layer did at the time was simply replace their old steam-powered factory equipment with electric motors. Now, what they didn't do was take advantage of the flexibility that the electric motor provided in the way that they could then redesign their processes, the way the factory was laid out. And that actually fell to the next generation of managers, who then were able to redistribute the machinery, look at the processes, and productivity then soared, sometimes doubling or even tripling in the case of some of SKF's plants. And today, I think we face a similar challenge. We need to ensure that we're not simply replacing legacy technologies with these new tool sets, but we've got to look at the value behind why we're doing this. What are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And then how do those technologies underpin that? So that goes back to the conversation that you and Jim have just had. Now, in terms of what we see, again, from an industry perspective, I think the conversation that we keep coming back to is around three sort of macro trends that are facing engineering and manufacturing companies today. Now, the first one on the left there you can see is worker shortage. This is all about the aging workforce, the fact that a lot of experience is retiring from the shop floor, retiring from within the engineering organization, and how do we actually go about plugging that skills gap? In the middle, we've got the risk and the cost pressure. So this constant pressure for industrial companies to is increasing as the competitive pressure from others in their market continues to grow. Add to that, you've got unsettled supply chains, you've got environmental, regulatory pressures around carbon debt and circular economy, and it's making for a tough time for many manufacturers today. And lastly, this concept of digital disruption is coming at these companies from almost every direction, and often from below, it has to be said, where you've got smaller companies, perhaps slightly more agile, that are looking at new ways of applying these digital technologies that are taking market share. So I think all of this combines to mean that companies of all sizes are looking to invest in this concept of DX, digital transformation. But I think knowing where to start and how to scale those early successes that you might have had is often the challenge that these companies are facing. Now, I just want to touch just very briefly on the COVID crisis. And I think obviously the pandemic has had an impact on all our professional and personal lives. Now, I just want to reference a comment from our CEO, Jim Heppelman, at our virtual LiveWorks event last year, where he used the phrase, the digital genie is out of the bottle and it won't go back in. And he used that to describe the adoption of digital technologies. Now, by way of an example, I was personally involved with the ventilator challenge here in the UK, which was the government's sort of call to action from industry to help scale the production of ventilators to meet the demand from our National Health Service. Now, it was interesting because the shared urgency, the critical nature of that project meant that companies from across all industries of all sizes came together very, very quickly to set up infrastructures around these digital technologies to actually increase production of these two ventilators from what were the sort of tens of units per month all the way up to sort of the many hundreds as we got to. And we were there helping with augmented reality, using that technology to capture assembly and test processes from the original manufacturers, and then transplanting that information to the new manufacturers so they could understand how to assemble and test these pieces of equipment without ever setting foot in each other's factory, which was, of course, a massive contamination risk at the time. And I think the exercise, combined with many of the other ones that took place around the world at the time, I think forced the hand of a lot of manufacturers to investigate and deploy Industry 4 tools. And that provided, I think now what we see is the knowledge and the experience that many of these people have got to actually start to deploy these technologies inside their own companies now that things are gradually starting to return to the normal. And we certainly see, companies again using these technologies perhaps quicker, sooner, at better scale than they would have done without that exercise. Now, in terms of where we are with digital transformation, I think we've seen a shift in the last 5 years from companies looking at, do these technologies actually work, and can we make them do something, which was all about that time when they were testing the technologies, to how do I drive business value from implementing them. And so I think the benefits today are proven, and you can see some of the use cases down the left-hand side here with the sort of range of impact that we will see. And this allows companies to, perhaps the range of use cases allows companies to start their digital transformation journey from any number of starting points. But what I think is most important, and this was touched upon a moment ago, is that it has to be aligned to the business need and ultimately to the shareholder value that you're trying to generate as a company. Now, if you can't explain how your digital transformation project is either going to make you money or save you money, then you're probably in that technology-driven exercise that I mentioned a moment ago. And the reality is that today you really don't need to be doing that, because the technology is proven to work, and your starting point, therefore, needs to be the business. But where do you start to look? Now, we see digital transformation focused around 4 key areas within a business. Starting on the left side, we've got the notion of a connected product. So the benefit of knowing how your product is performing in the field with your customer. Now, typically this starts around asset monitoring, but it can extend all the way up to sort of predictive maintenance scenarios, but can also include things like smart servicing. Perhaps the customer could self-service their product using an AR-driven experience, or simply the ability to even connect the field technician back to the expert in the factory is another sort of straightforward example of how these digital technologies can perhaps improve that first time fix rate. On the right side, we've got smart factory capabilities and processes. Now, this is all about the ability to pull together that vast amount of operational data from the shop floor to either perhaps increase your equipment uptime, to reduce the amount of scrap and rework that you have within your business, and also to combine it with other data sources that you have within your business to make better decisions about your product. For example, why did this particular machining tolerance that was specified by the engineering group actually result in a higher efficiency product, an engine perhaps, actually out in the field with your customer? And then at the top, we have our connected worker. I think this includes a variety of use cases, ranging from the one of which we talked about earlier, the aging workforce, to perhaps shop floor workers receiving, more configuration-specific information about a particular process that they're involved with. Maybe it's quality assurance on a production line where you've got high variability. Being able to receive that configuration-specific information is really important. And then lastly, at the bottom, we've got our connected workplaces. And this area in particular, I would say, has been impacted heavily by the pandemic. And it includes all of the technologies that allow remote working, for geographically dispersed engineering teams to collaborate together easily. But it also extends to some more advanced use cases around things like spatial technologies on the shop floor to drive consistency and increase productivity from the worker within the workspace. So given we have these four areas that we focus on, and it looks relatively straightforward, what can and often does go wrong with the digital transformation process? Now, this example slide here is one which we worked on, and it's the expected benefits from a DX with a high-tech company in the US. Now, the numbers obviously are fictitious, but what you're looking at represents part of the output from a structured framework to align the digital transformation effort with the strategic goals within the business, to understand, what is the expected value from the program? Where is it going to come from? How much are we going to get from each of the use cases that we're working on? And also as a business, when can we expect these improvements? Now, this for us, I think, represents a company which we believe is going about digital transformation in the right way. But again, for every one of these, there are countless others that are making small mistakes, which are having a big impact on the way in which these programs go or go to execute. So what can and does go wrong in these processes? Well, we often see two mistakes. The first one is that technology can be, you focus more on a technology-driven use case, missing and actually miss the constraint part of the business, which is where the value is to be unlocked. And secondly, we also see a lot of companies starting with perhaps too many parallel projects, which lead to a lot of fragmentation within the set of results set that you get. And it's difficult for the company to then pinpoint exactly where they go. And that in turn is often the reason why they struggle then to scale anything, because that notion of digital transformation perhaps has got a little bit lost at the CxO level, because they've not necessarily been able to see any sort of tangible benefit from that transformation that was expected. Now, the term for a lot of this stuff we've used in the past is around pilot purgatory. And thankfully, we see a lot less of that pilot purgatory, that technology-driven exercise, than we used to in the past. But what we do see today is perhaps a different type of purgatory, and this is around scale purgatory. So, manufacturers and engineering companies are often challenged in the way in which they're able to duplicate the success that they've seen in a particular pilot area to get it to scale across the business. And even if they can get it to scale, are they going to see, all the expected benefits that they were looking for, or perhaps just a fraction of the savings that they're expecting? So looking ahead, and then, how do we actually go about identifying the value of the transformation, and what would the process look like for us to do that? We start here with just a sort of high-level view on this, and we're going to begin with the impact. So this is about, as I think Jim mentioned, aligning what you're about to do with your company's strategic goals. Now, if what you're about to tackle is not a known problem within the business that's big enough for the company to want to spend money on to fix, then your project is likely either not going to be visible at that CxO level, or it's not going to receive the funding it needs, even if you can get it off the ground, or a combination of both of those things. Now, the key to that is understanding the value. How much, how sure are we of the value, and when can we expect it? Now, I think particularly in today's business climate, we're looking at companies trying to get some form of payback within a 12-month period for any digital transformation project or a particular use case. So it's important that those use cases that you select are high impact and relatively simple to deploy and be adopted by the users within your business. And part of that and growing from there is the ability then to plan that digital transformation journey. So the journey is going to include many use cases. Some of these are interrelated, while others can be standalone. Anything that's interrelated requires likely requires the deployment of some foundation use cases. So typically those building blocks that are going to need to be done first. So you need to plan accordingly. For example, if you're going to sort of work within your connected factory environment, then let's look at what are the constraint assets within that manufacturing process, rather than just trying to connect the whole line, because that's a much bigger job and won't yield the ROI within that first year. And you've also got to be realistic in the rollout of the phases and also the use cases that you're going to deploy. And don't overestimate the speed at which you can generate results. So, for example, if you've got any type of predictive analytics within your use cases, then the reality is it's going to take time for you to generate the volume of data on which you're going to build the machine learning model to allow you to create that predictive insight. And so it does take time. And then if we think about proving and scaling, it's essential that you have the defined metrics that are going to validate that expected ROI during the prove stage, and that these are going to be understood and accepted by all of the stakeholders. So it forms the basis of your ability to go and scale. And of course, scale can't be achieved without the right ecosystem of partners. And we'll touch on this briefly a little bit later on. And lastly, of course, this is not a linear process, right? There is the ability and the need to refine, to feedback, to course correct and adjust what you're doing based on the business. And let's face it, nobody ever gets it right, exactly right, first time. And when we're talking about that digital transformation within your business, which departments are likely to benefit from this? Where do you go and look? Who do you need to involve from a stakeholder perspective? And this slide sort of captures, again, some of those high level areas where we see these benefits. In engineering, there's the potential, there's the reduction of poor quality within your business. There's an increase in the cycle time. We've got a quicker route to sort of process your change orders. And all of this can be delivered via model-based systems engineering, system models, simulation-driven design, generative, all of those sort of engineering capabilities that fall into these digital transformation tools. We touched a little bit on manufacturing a moment ago, but we see the common effort here around productivity, around quality management, reducing downtime, improving yield, and obviously reducing waste within the factory. Carlsberg, one of the leading brewery groups in the world, they improved their planning, their quality control on their packaging lines, and delivered a significant increase in OEE from the work that they were doing. And at BAE Systems, for example, the defense company, they are using now augmented reality alongside the IoT platform to achieve a 50% improvement in the way in which they assemble. In this case, it's actually electric bus batteries for this particular use case, and also a 30% reduction in the training time for the individuals on the shop floor and better consistency from them. And lastly, just briefly on service and service optimization, again, reduction in the time spent for field engineers, actually perhaps spent with your asset in the field. technicians, if they are going to go on site, they're going to be more productive with what they're doing, and also improving that first time fix rate, either by connecting back to the expert in the field or having access to the information they need to perform that service activity there and then. So again, when we talk about the developing this business case involving stakeholders from across all of the different departmental groups, I think is critical. And again, there's very few areas within a business these days that digital transformation cannot impact. Now, just moving on to the actual process of actually building that business case, and part of that is the value assessment. It is a building block, a fundamental step in what you're going to be doing from your digital transformation project. Now, broadly speaking, we see companies falling into one of two buckets when we're working with them. There's companies that actually want to do this themselves, and they have their own business improvement groups within the business, and they take care of this value case and the ROI all themselves. And then we see other companies that actually welcome and solicit the opinion from external companies, either ourselves or business consultants and system integrators. And of course, I would always advocate this idea that you're going to work with some external group that's going to help you by ensuring that you're looking at the full breadth of what digital transformation can do, that you understand exactly how broad the spectrum is. And of course, what they will bring is also some knowledge of the percentage gains or the percentage savings that each of the use cases can offer based on tangible experience that they can call upon. So again, enlisting the help of others is important. I think it's also clear that, in the last 18 months, almost all of this will have perhaps need to have been done remotely, but that isn't a blocker. That's not really a hindrance to actually identifying the potential value that you have and building up this idea of an aligned value roadmap, which all the stakeholders that we talked about from the other departments are actually going to stand behind. Now, as part of that workshop, it's essential that you start with a full understanding of the value drivers of digital transformation. Now, most established consulting groups that are working in this space will have this type of view, and they represent the starting point for the conversations with all of your different stakeholders within your business. Now, each of these use cases need to be grouped in some way, based often on the business impact, and of course linked back to that topic of shareholder value that I talked about earlier around revenue growth, around reduced operating costs, or getting better asset efficiency. And as I mentioned also, some of these are also interrelated, these particular value drivers. So if we look at the sort of 9 o'clock position on the slide, availability, performance, quality, anybody in the manufacturing space will recognize those as the key ingredients for your OEE metric. So if you want to do OEE within your factory, you're going to need to focus on those. And of course, part of that value workshop will be to look at that. And just moving on perhaps to the next step in the process. So this is about turning that list of value drivers that we just saw on the previous slide into a plan. And that involves understanding the potential impact that these use cases can have. First of all, are they high impact, low impact? And that's obviously specific on the individual business, and also the speed and ease at which they can be implemented. Now, experience from the consulting groups combined with the detailed knowledge of the stakeholders, it's that combination of people that are going to generate the most accurate results in terms of, where are the low-hanging fruit use cases that are going to deliver that early ROI, that early payback that I talked about earlier on. And so you'll typically end up with a diagram, something similar to this simplified version that I'm sharing with you on the screen now. And then, of course, there is this concept of how quickly do you do all of this? How quickly does it make sense for us to plan this work? And I think it's essential that with any transformation, it is about doing this in phases or different waves of transformation. And that, of course, has to align with your business goals as a company, but it also has to align with other business factors. You may have seasonal variability within your production. You may have other business initiatives going on around other technology transformations, which also need to dovetail with the work that you're doing with the digital transformation. And that will force certain certain use cases to be done at a set time within your business cycle. And of course, any of this, all of it needs to be sort of wrapped up in this idea of the value roadmap that is that North Star that the business can look against. And of course, again, looking at the individual use cases that you've talked about and you've prioritized, the actual expected value that you're going to get from that across your factory, your network of factories, across your engineering departments and so forth, that value also needs to be sort of added up. It needs to be then applied to the roadmap so people understand the size of the prize that's on offer to get this right. Looking at this a slightly different way, you also see this here in a sort of a little bit more of a timeline. But again, the real point here is to really just make out that there is never just one sort of pilot effort here. That pilots take place at different times within the phasing of that digital transformation program. So we've got a wave 1 pre-production environment, a wave 2 pre-production environment, and a wave 3, and so forth. And it's by doing this that, again, allows the process to stay agile, to course correct if needs be, and to stay on track with the goals. I'm conscious of time, Jeremy. I'll just step through a few more slides here, and then we can get back to some Q&A. One last slide to talk about when we talk about this sort of consulting exercise, this engagement that you're doing about the transformational value. One thing that we will always leave our customer with is a single slide summary that is going to be used to generate that CxO level interest, to be able to illustrate what we're going to be doing and when, how we're going to do it, which particular areas of the business is it going to focus upon, and what are the use cases that underpin that, and then what is the expected value across the timeline of 3 to 5 years, whatever it might be. And so this, in terms of that stakeholder alignment at the most senior levels within the company, it is essential. One slide needs to explain what you're going to be doing and what you have in terms of an output. And I think, again, it's also a very useful thing just in terms of a single sort of slide that allows the company to get behind the whole of the program. Now, I do want to just finish by touching on the importance of digital transformation being a team game, and the need for any company, I think, to work within or work with a number of partners along the way. Now, it's very rare that we find any company that's been able to do a successful digital transformation without the help of others. It certainly was possible more in the early days when things were a little bit smaller, but I think it's fair to say that today, no one company does it all. And so there is a broad range of partnership types and partners within those types that you will likely need to call upon to be successful. Now, just starting really at the sort of midday position here on the wheel, management consultants, if you are looking at that sort of high level value, the strategic direction of your company, you know, these types of consultants, the McKinseys, the BCGs of this world, the Ernst & Youngs, the EYs, we have, you know, or they have significant experience around digital transformation and helping companies build out that approach. Moving around, you've got your global system integrators. So here, again, these are the larger organizations that are going to help you deploy at scale, but they're also there to help you generate a more agile approach to those early pilots that you may be doing. And I will also mention that just at the, what would we say, about 10 o'clock to midday position, you've got regional system integrators. So just a handful of the ones that we work with here in the UK and in France. But these are the smaller organizations that provide real depth of expertise and experience in certain particular areas. Jim talked about security earlier on today. There's a few security partners that we work with, companies like Device Authority, for example. You know, they are there as well. But then on the left side, around the technology partners, this is really where I think there is a huge amount of complexity, but also a huge amount of options in terms of how you work. Everything from the different sensor types that you're going to use, the edge equipment that you're actually going to connect these sensors with, you know, all the way up to perhaps who is going to be your cloud hosting partner. How are you actually going to scale this beyond that first factory or your first 100 products out in the field? So again, the partnership piece of this is critical. Now, one of the other things that these partners are also doing is publishing a huge amount of intellectual property and a huge amount of advisory content around digital transformation. And this goes from everything from companies like Architect in Germany, who were one of the, I think, originators of the Industry 4 model. They have a very detailed maturity index, they call it, their maturity model, around moving from where you are today to what does good look like in terms of Industry 4. And that goes all the way to the likes of the Harvard Business Review, Boston Consulting Group, who are producing insights into what does digital transformation look like at that executive level. Because again, a lot of that is about helping the executive, the C-suite, understand what's possible with digital transformation. And then lastly, I think in terms of that sheer number of players that we have in the digital transformation market today, lean on the analyst groups for clarity around who has the best vision and also who has the best ability to deploy that vision, the two axes that all technology vendors are going to be measured against. And that really doesn't matter whether it's your industrial IoT platform or it's your sensor provider. You know, they will have an offering, they will have a point of view on this. The market today, certainly for, if I look at where we sell ThingWorx in the industrial IoT market, when I started, there were probably no more than about 25 of those. Today, there's well over 400. Some of them very specialized, not doing so much in terms of breadth, others doing a huge amount. But use those industry analyst groups to give you that clarity on the market so that you don't necessarily spend too much time working either with partners that can't deploy or perhaps can't also meet your aspiration to scale what you're trying to do. And so I think just to sum up with my last slide, you know, the secret of success, again, you know, top down, create the greatest possible value. This really links back to the discussion that Jim and Jeremy, you had earlier on around making sure that we are identifying the value of the transformation. This is no longer about the technology. This is all about the business. It's about the processes. The technology simply underpins it. You got to get the stakeholders, the people first, get the stakeholders involved. They're the ones that are going to champion this through your business and make it successful. And of course, you know, use that broad perspective that an external group can provide. So you've got that holistic view of what digital transformation can do for you as a company with the minimal amount of risk to the disruption of your existing operations. So, Jeremy, that was it. I hope that was okay, and probably a little bit longer than I was planning, but hopefully useful. And we've got a few minutes for questions if there's any in the line.
We've got time. I'm getting echo on your speaker. Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Paul. And I think there's an awful lot of information that we can take away from that. And because this is available on our website from tomorrow, people can come back to this and reference it. Some great questions here. Please keep them coming. Questioner asks, Paul, this is one for you, I think. Which is more important to accomplish first? The digital transformation of the system or the human source or the stakeholders' knowledge about the digital transformation system, in this case about the management consultancy agency. So which do you think comes first?
Stakeholders. I would always advocate that the alignment of your management group within your business is one of the most fundamental things you can do. Because as I mentioned earlier, if you cannot, if the problem you're trying to solve is not visible at their level, is not a problem that's big enough that the company's really going to want to spend money to solve, then unfortunately it's going to be a technology exercise. And that, I think, is some of the early pitfalls that we saw many companies getting into, where they may well have made it work with a Raspberry Pi, but was it a problem big enough? No. And is it going to scale? No, as well, unfortunately. No. So I think that stakeholder one, in answer to that question, is definitely the most important step.
Absolutely clear. Thank you. Yasmin asks, and again, this is referencing what you just said about technologies and also goes back to one of your last slides, but it's a really pertinent point. She wants to know, in terms of the technologies, what kind of technologies do you think we're going to be focused on most in 2021 or 22?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think the answer is, again, we certainly see a lot of the technology today, I think, is focused at that sort of return to work and return to scale following the pandemic. Again, so any of these technologies that are going to support remote working, the collaborative environments, even down to sort of augmented reality driven sort of design reviews, companies adopting more cloud-based technologies because that provides them with the flexibility for remote working. I think all of that is going to be part of what we see. And that also applies in the factory space as well. The ability for sort of remote monitoring of equipment, the ability to sort of interact with machinery via an IoT platform, reducing scrap, and rework and so forth. I think these are all the things that certainly we see today, combined with this aging workforce problem that I talked about as well. We see a huge amount of interest in that because it also helps with flexibility within your business to reskill and transfer knowledge from one department to another.
Fair enough. We're definitely not going to have time for all of the questions, so we will pass these on to the speakers afterwards. Jim, I'm going to come to you first, and Paul, I'd like you to answer the same as well, if you could. Questioner asks, how can we justify the ROI for a digital transformation investment to the board or investors? I mean, you've touched on that, both of you already. Is there a framework that you can use to assess the investment outcomes? That's what the questioner would like to know. Could you give me a 30-seconder on that, Jim, please?
There are business case frameworks available, and I think this spins back to the beginning of where we open this webinar, which is around the scope of the business case and understanding where it begins, where it ends, what the components should be, and how the costs, which are components of that business case, should be shared between that business case and future development. This is something that Paul mentioned, I think, with these foundational use cases. They're not just relevant to the first problem, they have an ongoing value.
Yeah, and done in 30 seconds. Admirable. Thank you. Paul, your thoughts in 30 seconds on this, please.
Yeah, fully aligned with what Jim's just said. I think, again, anybody that's been involved with digital transformation over the last sort of 5 years will have their own knowledge that they've gained through their experience, combined with industry data and academic data around what can be expected from a use case. What impact can you expect? That is obviously dependent upon your starting point as a company in terms of what you're doing today. But that ability for you to move from where you are on a maturity scale to where we think what good looks like, that will enable you then to plot the value that you can get from a particular use case.
Brilliant. I'm going to be cheeky and sneak one more question in and get my knuckles wrapped, but that doesn't matter. The questioner here wants to know, and this is for you, Paul, 30 seconds if you can. How can we integrate with the existing IT and OT infrastructure?
Great question. Not an easy one to answer in 30 seconds. Let me just give you a quick sort of headlines on this. There are technologies out there. We obviously have our Kepware solution, which is that sort of integration layer between the OT and IT technologies. It provides the library that you need to integrate with your PLCs to actually pull data from PLCs, pull data from other edge devices, or even sort of, use the existing sort of languages, MQTT, whatever you may have on your shop floor. That is going to be that gateway to the sort of IT world that allows you to consolidate OT and IT data and contextualize it within your IoT platform. So, in 30 seconds, Jeremy, that's my answer, but I'm more
tough
than
ask. Well, we can follow that up, but that was admirable. Sadly, that is all we have time for. The aim of the webinar has been to learn as much as we can on how to pitch your board or your investors for digital investments at scale. And we've heard an amazing number of tips here, but clearly there is more that can be learned. So pick it up with our speakers afterwards. Please remember to bookmark our website at iot-now.com, and you'll find there the latest news, blogs, events, and interviews. And tomorrow you can stream this webinar from our site. It just remains for me to say a huge thank you to our speakers. First, Paul Hames of PTC. Thank you, Paul.
Pleasure. Thank you, Jeremy.
Brilliant. And thanks too to Jim Morrish.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Brilliant, Jim. Thank you for your input. It's been much appreciated as well. Most of all, ladies and gentlemen, I want to say thank you for joining us wherever you are. Keep safe. We really appreciate the time you spent with us. From everyone here at IoT Now, enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.